Hello and welcome. You are listening to a podcast by the Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath. I'm Professor Turi King, your host, and today I'm talking to Associate Professor Emma Stone, who leads the Bat Conservation Research Lab. Her research is around conservation biology, in particular, the behavioral and ecological responses of wildlife to changes in the environment. She's also recently been awarded a lottery fund grant for a citizen science project, the North Somerset Bat Survey, in collaboration with the North Somerset Council. Emma, I always love hearing about what it was that got people into the research area that they're in. So what was it for you?
Well, I think with bats, they're so unusual and they're really understudied. So it was wide open as a topic for me. So when I sort of realised that I'm actually quite interested in understanding why species are endangered and how we can help conserve them, that was my driver rather than the species itself. I suddenly sort of opened the doors to lots of different species that I could work with. And in the UK particularly, there's lots of challenges around bat conservation because they occupy lots of buildings, they create a lot of conflict. And so because they're really heavily protected, there's lots of need to understand how we can best mitigate those challenges. So I started to do a bit of consultancy work at the start of my PhD and realised we got some really cool bats and they do lots of really cool behaviours throughout the year. They've got a really interesting life cycle. They're quite fascinating if you're into evolutionary biology. You know, the evolutionary arms race between bats and moths, how they're sort of fighting against each other and who's winning at any given point. And then I realised, well, strangely enough, hardly anyone works with bats and we don't really know that much about them. So there's lots to be done, particularly around conservation. There's tons to be done. And then alongside that, their PR is not so great. Not many people like them. And I always like the underdog. So that was a win-win for me as well. So that's why I started to work with bats and it's just gone from there, really.
So tell me about the evolution of bats.
Yeah, so they're really fascinating. So they've been around for millions of years. You know, they've evolved over time into two distinct groups. So you've got fruit-eating bats and mainly insectivorous-eating bats. So you've got these fruit bats, they're using their eyes and smell. And then you've got the echolocating bats, the insectivorous bats, which are using echolocation, which in itself is fascinating. And the fact that they've evolved to see with sound is a whole topic in itself that you can just get lost in. So over time, we've got these two groups and we've got over 1,400 species globally. And in the UK, they represent about a third of all mammals. So most people don't realise that they're really abundant and they're the only mammal that have the true power of flight. So they don't glide through the air, they actually fly as birds do. So they're quite agile, they're quite fascinating in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think bats are really cool. And you mentioned this thing, echolocation. So for people who don't know what echolocation is, what is echolocation?
Yeah, of course. So it's how bats see in the night environment. So they've evolved to live at night, which very few species do. And to do that, you think to yourself, well, how on earth are they getting around? How are they finding their food? Well, rather than using vision, they use echolocation. And echolocation is the same principle as sonar, so it's the same as what dolphins, etc. use, where they shout out a noise and they'll wait for the echo to come back as that sound bounces off an object. And how far they are from something is determined by how quickly that echo comes back. But what's fascinating about bats is they've evolved a really diverse range of echolocation calls to differentiate between species. So when we work with bats, we can use ultrasonic detectors. So bats echolocate in ultrasound. And as they fly throughout their night environment, it guides them through. They can see what's around them, the objects. Some species are adapted to fly in really cluttered environments, so like dense woodlands, and they will have different calls to those species that fly in open environments like fields. And some people always say to me things like, oh, bats, don't they get stuck in your hair? Well, actually, their echolocation doesn't allow that to happen because they're so good at seeing with sound. So in fact, if you have a spider on a web, they can actually see what side of the web the spider is on. So they know where to approach the web from which side, which I think is quite fascinating considering it's complete darkness.
So why do you think bats have such a bad press, particularly because people hardly ever come into contact with them, really?
I think there's a historical fear of bats because it's fear of the unknown, right? So as you say, you don't see them. So not having any direct contact with the bat, you might see it in the garden, but it's just this fleeting shadow that's flying around. Whereas birds, you get to sit and watch them in the daytime. You don't really get to do that with bats. So I think there's a bit of fear of the unknown. Plus, of course, it's nighttime and Halloween and, all the historic links to Batman and, all of those negative connotations that we've had around bats for many years. Spooky, nighttime, Halloween-y type associations don't do bats any favours whatsoever. And then, of course, COVID pandemic, all linked back to bats. They carry many diseases, and we know that they carry coronaviruses. And the original DNA sequence, the closest one, is from a bat. There's a whole range of reasons, I think, why people are fearful of bats. And in the UK, I think we're also challenged by legislation because bats have had historical declines across Europe and globally. But in Europe, we've got quite strict enforcement of legislation, and every bat species in the UK is legally protected to a high level, to the point where if a bat was in your building and it was in your loft, legally you're not allowed to go into that loft unless you have a license. So that can create a bit of conflict for people, particularly when people are developing homes or they just want to do a barn conversion or whatever it is they want to do. All of a sudden, bats are a problem because they're going to cost you a ton of money. You're going to have to get surveyors in. You're going to have to pay for a license. So I think all of these things make people fearful and have negative perceptions around bats. But having said that, there's lots of opportunity for good PR around bats because they're so fascinating. So it just needs people to understand a bit more, I think.
And that's really important because bats are actually really an important part of our ecosystem. Let's promote bats.
Yeah.
What's important about bats?
This is an easy one. So, we know a lot about biodiversity now and what role they play in sustaining our well-being. So they provide what we call ecosystem services. And so they're pollinators because you have nectarous bats, which are basically the equivalent of hummingbirds. So there are some plants that are called Cryptophilus plants, which are only pollinated by bats. So they've evolved completely with bats. So without the bats, those plants wouldn't exist. They also control insect pests. And there was a study a little while back in America that showed that in the absence of bats, farmers would be having to pay millions of pounds per year in pesticides. So they're controlling insect pests. They're transporting nutrients through the landscape by doing that, through their poops. And they're also really strong indicators of ecosystem health. So if you've got a variety of bats there, they're having to eat a whole range of insects. That means it's quite a healthy ecosystem. So working from the bottom of the food web up, through the insects up to the bats, if there's lots of diverse bat species and plenty of them, we can know that it's going to be a good, healthy ecosystem. So yeah, they're really important for us.
So tell me about this arms race between moths and bats, because that sounds really interesting.
No, it's amazing. Of course, this is the insectivorous bats. So out they are, flying around, hunting their insects. And of course, the insects have got to try and evolve to avoid being killed and eaten. So over time, bats, evolve echolocation. They use their echolocation calls to what we call target locate an insect. And then they'll hone in on that insect and they'll go in for the kill to eat it. So over time, what moths have done is they've evolved a tympanoid organ, which is an ear. Well, some moths have. And their tympanoid organ is specifically tuned in to the certain species that likes to eat them. And then, of course, they can hear the bats coming. So they then evolve all these different evasive procedures. So like doing spiral dives to the floor, etc. And in response to that, the bats started to turn off their echolocation calls. So they turned into what we call whispering bats. So they went really quiet, went into sort of like stealth mode, and then evolved longer ears so that they could hear. So then instead of using echolocation when they get close to the insect, they listen to the wing beats of the moths. So you've got this constant evolutionary arms race. So now we discovered more recently, for example, there are certain moths that have developed striations on their moth cells. So using really, really high-powered microscopes, we put the moth's wings under the microscope because they were able to avoid detection by bats without having any sort of behavioural response. So some moths would fly to the ground and go still because they know that the bats are listening for wing beats. These moths would just carry on as normal. And we were thinking for years, how on earth are they not getting eaten? And then we discovered by looking at their wings that they've got these little striations, these little lines, these grooves on their cells of their wings, a bit like a sound room where you see, in soundproof rooms, you have that foam on the walls and that absorbs the sound. Well, the moth's wings are doing exactly that. So the bat was echolocating, shouting out its sound, and then it was just being completely dumbed by the moth's wing. So it would just completely soak up the sound and no echo would return. So the moths were effectively acoustically invisible to the bats, which I think is fascinating. You know, that they can evolve over time to have these strategies, and it's just ongoing. So if you're an evolutionary biologist, go and work with bats, because there's lots to be done there, and it's incredibly fascinating.
And you've taken us really nicely into something there, because we're changing their environment.
Yeah, sure.
So how are we changing their environment, and how are they reacting to that?
Well, I mean, it's multifaceted, isn't it? And it's not just bats, it's all biodiversity. But again, like we touched on, bats are really good indicators, and they occupy the nighttime environment. And that's changing significantly. We are daytime animals, you know. We like everything to be nice and bright. But for certain species, light is not good, you know. They're adapted to nocturnal environment. And we have circadian rhythms. So our body and our system is dictated by the light-dark cycle, just the same as bats are. So one of the big ways that we're really impacting bats is through artificial lighting. So we're doing a lot of research around that and trying to understand really how it affects their behaviour and how that might have knock-on effects for their survival and their fitness and then conservation status. That's what we really want to get to. And because across the world, lighting is increasing globally, but not only is it increasing globally, previously it wasn't really considered light pollution because we see it as a positive thing, you know, light it up and then you're safer and you can see where you're going. But actually it's a form of pollution, and it's one of the biggest growing types of pollution globally. And not only is it growing in terms of the spread, geographic scope and the amount, it's changing in terms of type of technology. And the type of lighting that we're using, it used to be, if you remember back in the day, really orangey street lights, for example, where you couldn't really tell the difference between colours. So for visual acuity for humans was pretty poor, but you can still see. Whereas now we're going more to the blue-white end of the spectrum with the LEDs, which are great in terms of CO2 and efficiency, but they're really bright and they're very white. And so there's all these questions around how is that going to impact bats? Is it better to have a red light, an amber light or a white light? What are the light levels that are okay for bats, if there is one at all? How does it affect their behaviours, their breeding, their socialising? You know, how does it affect their health, their physiology? So these are all questions that we're trying to understand. And we know already that for most species, lighting has a negative effect on bats, and it can disrupt their feeding behaviours. It disrupts their movement throughout the landscape, which has a knock-on effect on their feeding. And then a big project we're working on at the moment is to try and understand how it affects their fitness, so whether it affects their breeding. So there's been some indications that the babies of bats, it affects their growth rates in areas where there's lots of light pollution. So we're trying to get more understanding around that to see any fitness level and colony level effects as well. So lighting's a big one. And then, of course, you've got loss of habitat, which affects everything, not just bats. And historically, bats, if they had the choice, most of them would roost in trees. And they used to be, as we all know, huge old-growth forests across the world. But they've all sadly disappeared over time as we've moved in and occupied it with agriculture or housing or construction of roads, etc. So a loss of trees has meant that bats have had to adapt. And what's happened is bats, they all roost in different ways. They all live in different places and they change that throughout the year as well. They've got a very complex life cycle. So a lot of bats have moved into our houses. They're moving in with us, you know. So if we're taking away their homes, they'll come and cohabit with us. And that creates its own issues in itself around conflict, because not everyone, as we've touched on, wants to live alongside bats.
Yeah.
So a loss of roosting habitat, a loss of foraging areas, so places where they can go and hunt for insects. That's meant that historically, most bats have been in decline. And so that's one of the key challenges.
So is there anything that we as individuals can do to help?
Sure, there's lots we can do. So, you know, bats, they need food, right? So one of the big things in the summer, instead of cutting your lawn all the time, allow the wildflowers to grow, allow what we consider weeds to grow. Because the more weeds, you know, the dandelions, which we think are weeds, but they're not, they're actually wild plants, they're wildflowers. The more of those that are growing, there's more insects about. And the more insects there are, the more bats there are. And with bats, they've got the challenge of climate change, which we haven't discussed, and it affects all biodiversity, and it's affecting their cycles. So bats hibernate in the winter, and they come out of hibernation when the temperatures rise to an amount where they think there's going to be enough food around. So it's all linked back to their insect prey. Well, those seasons are changing drastically, and we're getting milder winters and wetter summers. And so bats are coming out of hibernation a bit earlier, and yet there might not be any food. So the more you can plant native plant species in your garden and not mow straight away in early April and have all these so-called weeds around, the more insect food you're encouraging, and therefore the more bats will be able to survive. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is to think about lighting in your garden around your property. Do you need that 800-watt white security light? And does it have to be on every night? Probably not. You could easily get just a small 40-watt solar one that's just triggered when someone walks by and quickly goes off. And that's really going to help in terms of reducing the impacts on bats. And then also if you have got lights, for example, churches is one of my big bugbears, because quite often churches are lit up. They're illuminated as an architectural structure, and it can look really, really nice. But it means that those lights are shining straight up into the sky, which is not a good plan in terms of all wildlife, and including ourselves. There's negative effects on our health from artificial lighting. So if you have got lights, making sure they're pointing downwards to the ground, they're not, shining up too far above the 90-degree plane, so they're not creating pollution. So thinking about whether we need lights in the first place, whether you want white lights or more red lights. So we know that amber lights, the more orangey lights, are actually better for wildlife. So trying to get away from this blue-white end of the spectrum, lowering the intensity, so not having them so bright, and making sure they're only lighting what they need to light. They don't need to light the path, they don't need to light the whole side of your house. And those are little changes we can make, and if we all make those changes, that will really benefit not just bats, but all biodiversity. Other species are also negatively affected.
So your research really does lend itself to involving the public, because people can actually become a part of this. So you've got this grant to do a North Somerset Bat Survey. What's the aim of that?
Yeah, so we've been working with North Somerset Council, and as we all know, there's big challenges around housing and development and building. And so the government's pushing for more houses everywhere. And of course, most communities want to have nice green countryside and a bit of green belt, and they want to be connected to nature. So the councils and the government have big challenges around making those decisions. How do you decide where to put the houses? Where's best in terms of minimising impacts on nature and biodiversity? And as I said, bats are really good indicators for that. So we've been working with the council to use bats as an indicator of the health of all these different areas within the county. And so we thought it was a great opportunity to engage the public in that process. So we use bat detectors, and we have a set of bat detector kits. We have little loan centres like libraries and the National Trust properties, for example, locally. They host our kit sets, and then we have training sessions and videos online. And so the public can just sign up to get involved, and it shows them, and they get trained online. They can book out a kit via the website, go out somewhere local to where they live or even in their garden, put the acoustic detectors out for a week, and it automatically records all the bats. They then upload it to an online pipeline, and it will tell them what species they've got, which is quite fun. So you can see what bats you've got in your backyard. So it's great for people to get engaged in conservation, but also monitoring, but also having a bit of a say in what's going on in their local area, because all those data are collated, and we run some neat models and give them all to the council, and it helps them make really robust decisions about where best to develop. So, we can make these recommendations, say, well, this area is really good for bats. We've got some really rare species here. There's a bit of a nice corridor. We shouldn't really be letting development there. But getting people engaged in that process to allow them to make really well-informed decisions about where best they should develop or not throughout the county.
So you're also doing stuff with schools as well, aren't you?
We are indeed. So this year our National Lottery funding includes a whole bunch of funds that can help us work with schools. And that's a real key thing, because I think it starts when you're young to dispel those myths. So we're going to be engaging with a bunch of schools around North Somerset, working with the classes, doing some sessions, developing materials for teachers, and doing some bat events where kids can, design bat costumes, get dressed up as bats, learn about echolocation, and then also take part in the survey. So, give them some kits. They can go out, listen for bats. They can listen to the calls and identify what bats they've got in their school grounds. So we're really trying to engage the younger groups as well this year in the programme, and use that as a real opportunity to try to get them to embed bats into the curriculum. So we're going to be holding some big bat events this summer.
So what's next for you?
I think the sort of ultimate next stage for me would be what we're doing at county level, working with North Somerset Council, which is helping to improve their planning and inform their biodiversity conservation, is to be able to roll that out nationally. And to do that, then we need to go to Parliament really and speak to the policymakers and the change makers there. So I'm going to have to sort of get to understand a little bit about the political world and how politicians draft policy and make those changes so that we can then translate our research not just from one county, but across the country.
Emma, thank you so much for talking with me. This was a podcast by the Milner Centre for Evolution at the University of Bath. I'm Turi King, and thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts or comments on this or any other episodes, please contact us via our X channel @Milner Centre. For more information about the Milner Centre for Evolution, you can visit our website.